Welcome.
Thank you, Senator Dennis and members of the committee. My name is John Velardita, and I represent Clark County Education Association and the 18,000 licensed professionals in the school district. I'm joined today by our Director of Professional Learning, Brenda Pearson. She's going to do part 2 of our presentation. You know, we're here because we want to talk about a couple of things. Primarily, we want to start about a discussion around funding. I think in public comment, you heard a number of people speak to the fact that, you know, we need to have more funds for Nevada. Not a new conversation. It's been a conversation that's been had for many, many years. I think it speaks to the fact of the need. So what we'd like to go through is some things on our thinking on it. So in our first slide, we think there's 4 critical areas whenever you have a discussion of funding in the state of Nevada. The first is, what's our current funding sources? And there's 3 of them, state, local, and federal. The second is the current use of those resources. We think that's critical because they're fundamentally in 2 areas, DSA as well as categoricals. One's very prescriptive and restricted and the other isn't. And then moving forward, whenever we have a discussion around funding, we think the solution should be realistic. And I think, Senator Dennis, you led the way on SB 178, had a $1 billion price tag when we sat down in 2017. We had a discussion about what's real, what can we really do? And I think ultimately the compromise that came out of 178 was based on finding realistic solutions. We also think that part of finding realistic solutions is identifying new funds, but also looking at current resources and ask the question, could there be a realignment of those resources? And in part, that's what we're going to suggest today. But in the end, we think the 4th criteria is, what's the North Star of those resources? And the North Star of those resources are how they are applied to students as well as personnel, licensed professionals and non-licensed professionals. 88% of all costs in school districts is human capital. So the next slide, if I can go through, we'd like to talk about just briefly what the district current resources are. So the first area is, you know, the resources for students under the new reorg model. We've heard conversation about that earlier today, but you are all pretty familiar with it. You know, 469 said money has to follow the student, clearly. Fundamentally different than what it had been applied before under a centralized model. And out of that money, what's not restricted, 85 cents on the dollar, should go to those schools and should stay in those schools. And that central administration should be converted into a service agency that services those schools' precincts. And then categoricals, which are restricted, are still in application in the new reorg model. But we have to march towards a weighted funding formula, and that's part of what 469 is all about. The second thing, the personnel part of what currently exists at the school district level. I just want to talk about 2 things. One is SB 241 and the consequences of that. So as well as when you pass your distributive school account, you apply what's called roll-up monies that are supposed to be pass-through dollars for that human capital, salary improvements, steps and columns, benefits like health insurance, et cetera. 2 things that have occurred that should be on your thinking when you move forward. One, the distributed school account roll-ups, when they get to school districts, are discretionary. They have not met the intended purpose of what the legislature had passed. In other words, you passed 2% roll-ups this time. They did not go to salaries, and they did not go to benefits. They were used at the discretion of the school district. SB 241 was a compromise in 2015, and it immediately relieved legislatively the school district's obligation to fund compensation levels. And what do I mean by that? SB 241 was the removal of the evergreen clause. And once that occurred, school districts were not obligated to put into their budgets any additional money for steps and columns for any of the staff. Those are game changers. That's what we've been living through since that occurred. So the next thing I want to talk about is the categoricals versus weights. When we say a realignment of resources, we actually think it's time, and Senator Dennis, you know this, and Senator Woodhouse, you were there too during those Senate committee meetings when we said we should look at the categoricals, and at some point there has to be a discussion of how you transition categoricals to weights. So categoricals, the ones that have been very effective are prescriptive. They have intended outcomes. They have to be spent with intervention strategies the way the legislature passed it. But categoricals have their downside. They leave too many kids out, way too many kids. If you're not in a building, because that's where categorical dollars go, that student is left out of that money. It creates, and I would argue, legal exposure. So you can have a kid who's eligible for ELL funding under the Zoom program that does not get that because they're not in a Zoom school. At some point, the legislature needs to address that. So the other thing I want to share with you, though, is categoricals, as well as specific spendings, have a fiscal year 18 impact of close to $200 million of state funds that go down to school districts. The bulk of it that goes down to Clark. That's a significant growth of prescriptive spending. That's money that's outside of the DSA. That's something that should be put on the table. That's what we mean by when we say realignment of resources. And then finally, we would recommend that the 2019 session take up this whole discussion of when do we transition from categoricals to a weighted funding formula for all students. So now that leads me to a discussion around funding solutions. And you've heard in the public, you've heard in these hearings, and I'm sure that you've had in your work sessions discussions about funding. It's never ending in the state of Nevada. And I can tell you from our experience, the last 3 legislative sessions, politics determines funding in this state. Policy should be determining how that money is spent. But politics determines funding. Now, given that, we think that we should look at a few things. So the first thing is we've heard discussion about IP1 money and marijuana tax money. All good ideas in terms of revenue, but they have some things that has to be addressed if they're going to be seriously looked at. I'll never forget in the 2013 session, I had a conversation with the late Senator Debbie Smith around how do we fix the IP1 problem, where it's not being dumped into the DSA and used what it was intended for. And she said it's very simple. Anything moving forward, you have to find a backfill for the DSA. Every time that money goes into the DSA, you can't simply take it out and put it where it was supposed to go under IP1 without replacing that money. So any discussion about IP1 money has to be coupled with, okay, what do you replace it with? The second part is the marijuana dollars. Again, passed in the public, intended for education, didn't go completely that way. You all know the reasons for those that were part of the decision-making in the last session. You know, marijuana dollars are good for education, but they don't necessarily, are not necessarily enough for a solution. So then we've heard discussion about fund the base. And we think that that's a conversation, a very good conversation to have. It's a policy conversation, but it's going to be trumped by politics. And what do I mean by that? At some point, somebody has to have a discussion about what's the cost of funding the base? What's the appropriate level that defines what adequate funding is? And then more important, where's the source of that funding? I've been through the 2015 legislative session, as many of you have. We all know what it took to get that tax passed in 2015. It took Republicans and Democrats passing that, and it only got passed near the end of that session, and it wasn't easy to do. And that didn't even come close to the type of dollars we're talking about when we say let's adequately fund the base. And then finally, any kind of funding moving forward has to be based on a weighted funding formula model. So what we want to propose is simply something different. And that is, and we would ask this legislature to look at moving forward, and we're going to have a conversation, and we've had a conversation with the next governor for the state of Nevada around, can there also be a local revenue stream that we can look at? Notwithstanding what the state does, can we do that? And so what we would propose is the following. that a local school tax that's supported by the community that is outside of the distributive school account. In other words, it's not the local supplemental support tax that's part of the DSA, and if that goes up, less money comes from the state, but this is money that's outside of the distributive school account. The dollars clearly follow the student in the buildings, and the funds are prescriptive with identified outcomes. The central administration is a pass-through. This concept would say these dollars go directly to the school. So what do we mean by that? So for example, and we're not proposing a 1% sales tax increase in Clark County, but if you put a 1% sales tax on Clark County's revenue, that amounts to close to $400 million. What's $400 million? $400 million for this school district is approximately $1,250 for every kid out of 320,000. What's $1,250? Senator Dennis, you knows what $1,250 is. When we determined what SB 178 could spend, the key discussion was how much money makes a difference in buying intervention strategies. Was it 600? Was it 200? Was it 800? Because at some point, that money is wasted if it doesn't buy the effective intervention strategies. And we came up with, and SB 178 landed on $1,200 plus per student. So we would say, in looking at a local school tax, two paths the legislature could consider. One would be to empower a county through legislation to pass a special tax at the county level, or to allow for a ballot before the community to see if the community would pass local revenues to support their schools. I want to say this about it. Prior to the 2017 session, we did some field research to test a few things. One, we wanted to test the support for community controls over their community school. This was at the time when AB 469 was AB 394. And this whole concept of decentralized, involved parents, have the stakeholders have a say on how resources and student outcomes are done. And we found that parents and the community supported that kind of direction. We then tested, would you support additional revenue that you would contribute to in the form of some kind of tax if you knew how that money was being spent and it was going directly into those schools where your kids were. And the research 2 years ago demonstrated that there was public support for it. We're currently doing that same research now. So I only conclude on this by saying we know there's other solutions, and we know primarily most of the funding comes from the state. But after 3 successive legislative sessions where we've increased incrementally money, we've been left with a few things. One, we still need more money. 2, we got to make sure that whatever money is raised and spent has to be associated with outcomes. And 3, in our opinion, the state isn't the only source anymore to fix Nevada's funding issue. We think it should go to the local and let the community, or we say at the local level, decide. So that's part 1 of our presentation. Part 2 of our presentation is the other piece of investing those resources in licensed professionals.
Good afternoon, Chair Dennis and members of the committee. My name is Brenda Pearson. I'm the Director of Professional Learning at CCEA. Teacher shortages in Nevada are on the rise. In 2017, our state increased education funding $152 million, with $20 million specifically dedicated to the recruitment and the retention of our teachers. To date, there has been moderate progress towards the recruitment and retention issues that we face, but this progress is now at risk again. On June 18th, CCSD reported that 1,468 teachers have chosen to leave the school district. This reflects the departures from the district through mid-June. And with another 2 months before the school year begins, this number will only increase with the onslaught of retirement submissions. Annually, approximately 9% of our teaching profession, or 1,700 teachers, have left the district. In a recent report, Linda Darling Hammond estimated that the cost of recruiting and onboarding a teacher in an urban school district is $20,000. That results in an estimated annual cost to the district of $34 million. Teacher turnover undermines teacher quality, especially in the areas of high need. Disproportionately, schools categorized as Title I Tier 1 or Title I Tier 2 suffer from teacher vacancies at a higher rate than the other schools. Additionally, research demonstrates that high teacher turnover negatively impacts student achievement. Each and every day, there are estimated 18,000 students who do not have a qualified full-time teacher in their classroom in Clark County. Regardless of these efforts that we set forth as a state, the revolving door of teachers continues. Nevada will continue to hire teachers in greater numbers if we don't seek to retain those who we already serve. It is time we focused our attention on what conditions encourage teachers to stay in our schools. In January 2016, the Clark County School District began implementing a salary incentive program for professional growth. The professional growth system incentivizes educators to invest in their own practice while the district invests in their long-term retention within our schools. This system offers educators the opportunity to engage in high-quality professional learning that is aligned with professional goals, district incentives, and school needs. Educators are able to choose from a variety of professional learning opportunities, such as attending conferences, traditional professional development courses, and webinars. Additionally, the traditional plus 16 and plus 32 salary advancement option with graduate degrees still remains. For educators who have already received a master's degree or a doctoral degree, this traditional route may not be something that they're eager to pursue. The professional growth system has been aligned with existing statute as well. The Nevada Educator Performance Framework gives the professional growth system a structure by which teachers can monitor and be accountable for their own growth. At the beginning of each school year, educators review their professional growth with from the previous academic year. And in conjunction with the administrator, the educators set goals that are aligned with student learning goals and professional practice goals that will be met within the academic year. These goals are approved and acknowledged by both the educator and the administrator, and the educator engages in professional learning that will be in line with these goals. Documentation is maintained by the educator and shared with the administrator, both at the beginning, middle, and end of the semester. The salary incentive program for professional growth consists of three components. One, highly qualified professional learning opportunities to meet designated instructional and professional goals. Two, the alignment of instructional and professional goals with district initiatives, school needs, and student learning. And three, salary incentives.
2 minutes.
The absence of any of these components would result in an unstable and ineffective system, consequently impacting both teacher retention and student achievement. Teachers invest time and effort in the salary incentive program for professional growth, believing that their employer will honor their commitment. Educators in Clark County School District invest a minimum of 2 years or 3 years, depending upon the status of their school. The professional growth system is a major departure from the traditional salary system. The absence of experience with the innovative salary system has left some teachers resistant to change. And this system began in 2016, but there are no experience that people can share that they have grown professionally as well as been awarded a salary advancement. Trust is built upon experience and time, and currently the system doesn't have either. We have been able to develop transparency and support for the system, though, and on trust and confidence, teachers have invested their time. Approximately 2,200 teachers will be awarded the first salary incentives this year. This professional salary system has been found to be positively impacting student achievement. With its direct alignment with the Nevada Educator Performance Framework and the development of student learning goals, teachers can create professional goals that are a product of student learning goals. This enables schools to document students' progress towards their academic goals. Evidence of the progress in both Portland, Maine, and Los Angeles, California are on the screen. The professional growth system is unique, and there is a return on investment. The state of Nevada is making an investment in teachers' performance, the retention of our best and brightest teachers, and student achievement. But the effectiveness of this program presupposes consistent implementation. Nevada needs to fund this salary incentive program for professional growth to ensure that we are retaining all the teachers that we are serving.
Perfect. Perfect timing. All right. Questions? Vice Chair Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. If we could go to your slide on local revenue stream, I have a few questions on that, on the concept around it. So, I was wondering if you could share with us, is there a community similar to ours that didn't have such a base, but then they moved to that? So that's the first question. Is there, a real case study where that has occurred?
There is, and in fact, Dr. Jara can share the experience with the school district that he just recently came out. Notwithstanding state revenue and federal dollars, they do have local dollars, and I've spoken to him about that. It's not unusual in urban districts to have that additional revenue. What we're suggesting is something that's also outside of DSA, though. It's not, okay?
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying is we haven't had this. So I know you said Dr. Jara's community has it, but like, I want an example of like maybe in the last decade where a community has adopted something like this, and if you can share with us what were some of the challenges and some of the wins.
So we're in the process of preparing a white paper around this, and we'd love to submit it to the committee for record, and it's going to address the experiences nationwide in comparable urban school districts like this.
Okay, and then the follow-up is, so it would generate $400 million annually?
No, I use the example
okay,
if
you're just using, with the example, that would be
Yes.
an annual generation.
There would be,
Right.
and the reason why we picked 1% off of, say, sales taxes, we wanted to say, okay, how much additional resources make a difference? And one of the metrics we have is the experience of 178, where, as you were part of, the $1,200 plus is a resource for intervention strategies for at-risk kids. And the 1% off of the revenue at the sales revenue at the Clark would produce 400,000.
Okay, and then...
I mean, 400 million, I'm sorry.
And then is the disbursement of funding where it says follows the student, is it based off of equity?
Well, that's why it has to be based on the weights. So the dollars, so what we had presented earlier is that any kind of funding now has to transition to a fully weighted funding formula, which addresses that issue.
Okay, and then on your research, I'm sorry, and then I'll be done. On your research, can you share with us kind of the demographics of who you did this research with? Was it a homogeneous group, or was it a very diverse group of income brackets, business, faith-based? I mean, like who was a part of this survey?
So when we complete that paper, that would be part of what was in it, and we could submit that for the record.
Other questions? Senator Woodhouse.
Mr. Chair. Go ahead.
Yeah, we'll come back up there. Sorry. We'll go to Senator Woodhouse, and then we'll go to Senator Gustafson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question. You mentioned this would need to utilize the weighted system. So what kind of weights are you addressing? Are you using the ones that Senator Dennis's study committee came up with, the 1.5 and the 1.5 and the 2.0? Or do you have other weights that you are proposing?
No, the starting point is what Senator Dennis's study that was commissioned in 2015 produced, but we also know that those are being reviewed right now, but that's the starting point.
Yeah, that's the report that we'll get in August, at least the preliminary that has that. Senator Gustafson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's no question about it. We need to do something to retain our teachers. And, this is, just appalling to me that we have 1,700 teachers every year that are leaving, and we have to hire that many, or we have that many substitutes for a certain amount of students. That would be, if you had 1,700 teachers, to say the average 25 students per class, they're talking about over 40,000 students that are going to be stuck with a substitute teacher for who knows how long. But my question is, you used the example, I know it's just an example, of 1% sales tax would generate $400 million. That'd be about $1,250 per student. I guess the question is, would that be enough students? Would that be enough money to cover your needs, or if not, what would be? How much would we need?
That's an excellent question, and I want to go back to the way I framed this discussion, at least from our perspective. Politics determines funding in the state of Nevada. So given that, part one is how much realistically can you raise? And then within that context, how much can resource intervention strategies? We think, starting point, Clark County, this urban school district, additional $400 million on top of what their current revenue, whether it's restrictive via categoricals or as part of the DSA, $400 million on top of the current amount of money that's coming into the school district is the starting point for Clark.
Okay, thank you.